right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you may be joining us from around the world. My name is Avi Staiman, and I'm the founder and CEO of Academic Language Experts. Welcome to our first ever Publish My Paper, Ask the Expert session, where we answer your most pressing publication questions. As we get settled in, I encourage you to check in via the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us your name, your location, and area of research so we can get to know each other a bit better, because we're going to be starting some conversations. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to my co-host, Gareth Dyke, who is the Director of Global Content at Research Square. Gareth, thank you so much. Really excited to be launching this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. And good morning, everyone. Good evening. I know lots of people joining us from all over the world. I'm Gareth. I worked as an academic for 25 years in Ireland, in the US, in the UK, published 300 odd academic papers. Throughout that time, I also worked and continue to work as the editor-in-chief of a journal published by Taylor and Francis. The journal's called Historical Biology. Hey, I see we have a guest from Dublin. That's fantastic. Wonderful. Great to see you. So I'm hoping that in this session, we can help answering questions about peer review today, both from an author's perspective and also from the perspective of the journal editorial office. So helping people to learn about the tricks and ways in which you can manage and deal with peer review. So thanks very much for the invitation, Avi.
Yeah, pleasure. You know, we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, Gareth, but I sometimes feel like you and I in the field of author services, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. We're kind of the glue, right? That holds, that connects, or the bridge that connects between the publishers and the authors. And I think that a lot of times there's a lot of miscommunication and crossed wires and things that aren't clear to people. So that's why we're here today, is really to help you, give you an opportunity to express and ask your questions that maybe you haven't been able to ask or have been too shy to ask, and to really get them done. So Gareth and I have both been working in the field of author services, or the way I like to put it is helping scholars publish their research for over 25 combined years. In fact, Gareth, that probably is too low of a number, probably more than that, and have guided thousands of submissions, reviews, rewrites, revisions, critiques, edits, and held researchers' hand throughout. We've seen the tears of rejection, and I mean that literally. And we've also seen the triumph of success and the feeling and the rewarding feeling that comes with that. And oftentimes, it can be the same person can go through the same experiences. So we're here to help. We're going to be here until we get all of your questions answered, or until our partners tell us that we need to start. We need to get back to life. So don't be shy. Be sure to ask by raising your hand or submitting a question via the chat at any point. You can also, if you would prefer to keep your question anonymous, you're welcome to write a direct chat to Gareth or myself. We'll answer it without saying your name. So don't worry about that if you don't want everyone to know. The session will be recorded, and we'll send you a link in the next few days so you can rewatch or share it with your colleagues. So that is enough intro. Let's jump in here. So Gareth, just to get started, and I want to pass the baton on to our audience as quickly as possible. But just to get started here, I do want to ask just a beginning question, which is, can you just tell us about peer review and how that process works? Kind of like what the mechanics of it are, so that we're sort of all on the same page when it comes to asking questions about it.
Yeah, sure, of course. Now, we do lots of workshops on peer review, training for authors all over the world. And we usually start those workshops by asking the participants a question, which is, what is the function of peer review? What do you think the function of peer review is? And let me tell you that most people reply to that question in our workshops by saying something like, the function of peer review is to help me improve my paper, which is interesting. And that is one function of peer review, but it's not the function of peer review. The function of peer review is to ensure the quality of articles that get published in the academic literature, in the scholarly literature. It's the benchmark, it's the gold standard. So the function actually of peer review is to ensure the quality of articles that get published in the academic literature. A byproduct of that is that your paper gets improved, or at least we hope that your paper gets improved. So that's a starting point, I think, for our discussion today. How does it work? Well, you make a submission to a journal, and an editor in the editorial office, somebody like me sitting behind my computer working for historical biology, will assess your paper initially, and that's called the triage process or the desk assessment process. And at high impact factor journals like Nature, Science, BMJ, Lancet, those big journals, up to 9 out of 10 papers that get submitted could get rejected without being sent for peer review. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. How can you ensure that your paper has the highest chance of going out for peer review in the first place? We select peer reviewers. That's something that I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about in this session. And then we encourage them to give us comments on the academic content of the paper. And let me just finish by saying that even though we ask reviewers, and this is typical for journals, not to comment on the English, we ask reviewers, your job is to comment on the academic content, the scientific content, the quality of the hypotheses, the methods, and so on. Please, if you think there's a problem with the English, send it back to us and we'll ask the authors to get the English edited, get the English checked. But having said that, the most common comment that peer reviewers do make, even though we ask them not to, is often about the English. So hope that helps. That's a bit of a potted background introduction to the topic. Avi?
Yeah, first of all, I want to sign off on everything you're saying, Garrett. It'd be more fun if I could argue with you, but I agree with what you're saying. And I want to just put into context, like, what's at stake with peer review, right? You mentioned like the veracity and of published research. And I think to see what's at stake, all we need to do is look back at the last few years with the pandemic and think about the public's reaction to what is fact and what is fiction and what's in between. And I think when we talk about facts, really what we're saying are things that have been proven or seem to have a high probability according to the scientific method. Now, what's at stake is if we can successfully do the peer review process, so then what is known to the general world as fact is actually based on the peer-reviewed research. However, if there are things that get by that are fraudulent, which happen, if there are things that get by that are not peer-reviewed properly, which happens, and then they're published, and then they are proven to be incorrect, then all of a sudden we have a big problem on our hands. And it's more than just this study was proven not true. It actually undermines the believability and like trustworthiness of what is fact and what is fiction. And I think that we saw this during Corona, and it was a really big dilemma because we wanted to get the research out like super speed, right? That was like, let's get the vaccine and let's, understand what's going on. Let's publish. However, there were a number of studies that were put out too quickly without proper peer review and ended up creating gigantic messes, and maybe even at the cost of lives. So I just wanted to kind of put that into context, how important peer review is, and also not to whitewash its faults. There are a lot of problems, and maybe we'll talk about some of the problems. And I think Garrett did a great job explaining what the potential and what sort of like the ideal, what we want peer review to be. But in practice, it doesn't always look like that, that beautiful process that Garrett described. So I think that's enough to kind of as an introduction to get us started.
Awesome. Let me also just quickly say that it's actually quite a new process. I bet you didn't know that journals like Nature and Science only really started using peer review in the 1940s and as late as the 1960s for Nature. And so there's some great stories about Einstein papers, for example, when he submitted them to some physics journals and they got sent for peer review. He wasn't expecting that. He hadn't experienced it before in his own career. And there's a famous series of letters between Albert Einstein and the editor of the Physical Review, in which he complains bitterly that his paper gets sent out for review. He threatens the journal that he's going to withdraw the paper if they do send it for peer review. They actually did send it for peer review, and they sent Einstein the comments of one of his contemporaries. And he actually, in the end, appreciated the comments because he was able to improve the paper and correct a few mistakes. But I think it's worth knowing that people think that academic publishing is a very old process, but peer review actually isn't that old. So
Yeah, and one more comment, and then I really do want to open it up. So get ready. If you do have a question, go ahead and raise your hand or just unmute your microphone, and you can jump in here. One more point that I wanted to make is that something you said before, Gareth. If you sometimes, especially with junior scholars, you get a peer review and you're like, and it's like 3-4 pages long, 5 pages long, and there's tons of revisions and tons of comments, and you're like, oh my God, I thought this process was over. Like I thought I did my research. I thought I'm done with this. I'm on to my next study. I'm on to my next project. And it's very demoralizing. And sometimes, especially junior scholars will take it to heart and say, oh, well, maybe there's serious problems with my research. I'm like, it's not going to work. I want to comfort you and tell you, if it was really that bad, okay, it would not have made it to the whole peer review process. The fact that you are getting comments and revisions is a sign, even if you get rejected, and even if they're very harsh, is a sign that it passed the first barrier to entry, whether that's the managing editor of the journal, the chief editor of the journal who made a decision. This is worthwhile to the point where I want to send it out to peer review. So as harsh or as difficult or as frustrating as a review from from the reviewers may be, I want you to see it as a positive sign and not as a negative one overall. All right, Gareth, we ready to open mic this?
Absolutely, let's do it.
All right, let's do it. All right, anyone want to jump in? We do have some questions submitted ahead of time, so we can read those, but I'd much rather kind of open it up and and let's try and focus on just kind of the mechanics of how peer review works. If you've got a question about that, this is your time to jump in and ask. Maybe we were so clear and answered all of everybody's questions, but I don't think so. I would be very surprised. So we'll give everyone another, 30 seconds. And if not, maybe we'll, continue the conversation.
People must have, maybe you've got a paper that you're currently struggling to get through the peer review process. Maybe we can give you some advice on that.
We've got Afaf Muhammad had I don't know if Afaf is with us currently, but if he is, if they are here, then you're welcome to go ahead and ask your question. All right, so let's continue the conversation. And again, at any point, if you do have, a question, feel free to interrupt us. Like, this is meant to be informal. It's meant to be conversational. So, don't hesitate to kind of write your question in the comment or, just raise your hand. All right, so Gareth, what I kind of want to go to from here is talking about a little bit about the manuscript preparation process before you get to peer review, right? So that you're prepared properly for that process. So we had a question come in. How can I ensure that the peer review process doesn't drag on for a very long time, right? That's a big problem, is that like we work on our research and we send it off, and then we 6 months pass by and we haven't heard anything. We don't know if they're interested, not interested. And how do we make sure that and oftentimes what happens is we lose valuable time, publication time, right? We can't add it to our CV. We can't do anything with it. And we don't even know if it's going to be accepted. And sometimes by the time the article comes back, the research needs to be updated, and then we have to do a whole nother round. So is there anything for us to do about this?
Yeah, definitely. This is a very common question. Once I did a workshop in China and a researcher put their hand up and asked, I've been waiting for 2 years for my paper to come back from peer review. Now that's terrible. First thing to say is that the average time from submission to online publication is about 90 days. So what that means is that if you've submitted a paper to a journal and you've waited for more than 6 to 8 weeks as a benchmark without hearing back from the journal, it's time to stop waiting and start communicating with the journal. Write an email, get in touch with the editor. Lots of people think that editors, peer reviewers, they're unapproachable. You can't get in touch with them. The editor will think I'm rude if I write them an email. That's going to damage my chances of publication, but not at all. It's often the case that editors are academics working in universities, doing lots of other things as well. So they may just have forgotten about your paper. So do get in touch. I recommend actually that you suggest peer reviewers when you make your submissions. That's very, very important. Put the names of some suitable reviewers into your cover letter. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail in this session as well. But you must write to the editor after about 6 to 8 weeks so that you don't end up waiting and just twiddling your thumbs and nothing's happening from the journal. Be polite though. Be constructive, because we do get lots of emails from authors that say, where's my paper? Write me back immediately. The most important thing is to keep the editor on your side. So be polite, be constructive, and make suggestions. Maybe you can give me some updates on my paper, dear editor. Here's a few extra suggestions for peer reviewers that might be suitable to work on the paper. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right, Gareth, that, making suggestions for peer reviewers, sometimes the reason that it hasn't gotten back to you is simply because the journal doesn't have the time or capacity to be able to find someone appropriate. So first thing you want to ask yourself is, well, have I chosen the right journal, right? Because sometimes the struggle for them to find the peer reviewers is because it's not really exactly a field. I've come across a lot of scholars who they hear from a colleague that, like, you should publish in Nature, and that'll get your career jumpstart your career. So they just go to Nature, and then they're surprised, well, why am I not getting a response? So it's important to be realistic and build up slowly but surely to, like, the journals that, and learn the process. If you have groundbreaking research, don't hesitate, like, aim high. That would be great. But I do think that, it's good to help to kind of, like, go ahead and choose and, like, think carefully about which journal it is. And if you're not hearing back, maybe that's an issue. But like Gareth said, suggest reviewers. Now, Gareth, I'm curious what you think about disrequesting a reviewer. Do you think it's appropriate to say, I don't want this individual to be reviewing my paper? Because I know that sometimes there are, scholars who may disagree with our approach, or maybe there are personal issues. And is that like a bad sign for journals if we ask for someone not to review?
No, it's absolutely normal. And most submission systems, in fact, with some publishers, Taylor and Francis, for example, when you make your submission to a Taylor and Francis journal, you aren't allowed to suggest reviewers in the submission system. So you have to do that in the cover letter. That's an important point. That's been done by publishers because people were abusing the system often and making up email addresses, putting in email addresses for their friends. And we even had one researcher who put in his granny's email address, hoping to try to get the peer review sent to that particular person. So we only ask authors to deselect reviewers in the submission system. And that's absolutely fine. Like, there are many people potentially, or at least some people potentially, that you might not want to review your paper. And journals always follow those recommendations. So that's well worth knowing. We have editorial guidelines that tell us not to send papers for review to people who authors have deselected. So that's worth keeping in mind.
I want to make one point about circle back around to the question of how we choose the right journal for our research, because I think this is really critical. Because I think that most scholars, correct me if Gareth, if you've had different experience, most scholars, they'll look at they'll hear about a journal in their fields and they'll say, okay, this sounds interesting. They'll look at the impact factor, because for many scholars, that's an important consideration. And they tend to ignore other important information, okay? And I think there are a few things that scholars tend to ignore that are really critical to look at. Number one is always read the aims and scope of the journal and the abstracts from the last 2 to 3 volumes. You don't need to read all the papers, but you do need to ask yourself a critical question of, is my paper in conversation with previous research that's been done in this journal? If I'm coming and I'm saying something totally new and novel, as much as research is supposed to be new and novel, but it doesn't further a conversation that the journal is interested in, they may just reject your submission because they may say, this is interesting, but not to us. Okay, that's number one. Number two is there are 2 more data points that more and more publishers are putting up on their websites, which absolutely are critical to look at. Number one is acceptance percentage. How many articles are being accepted out of how many are being submitted? So there are certain journals that will take 30% of articles, certain journals that will take 20 and 10 and 5. And those numbers are dependent on a lot of different factors. It depends on how many submissions they have, how many articles, how many volumes they're sending out a year. But what's really critical is to see there's a big difference between sending to a journal that has a 15% acceptance rate as opposed to one that has a 5% acceptance rate. And you really want to be on top of, making sure that you are looking at that number to give yourself the best chance of success, assuming that it's the right fit. Number two is more and more journals are saying how long it takes for them to get back to you. And I saw a number of journals, even during the pandemic and even till now, who have said, listen, we have a backlog because we're understaffed. It's going to take a while for us to get back to you. And if that's the issue, you may want to think twice about submitting there. You may want to say, well, maybe even if this is a great place, if they're not going to get to it for a year, I'm going to burn valuable time. And in my opinion, junior researchers, it's more important to get used to that process and publish and go through that experience and learn how it works than it is to wait 5 years just to get your article into X place. You'll have more research, you'll have more work, you'll have more ideas. Like, don't bind yourself by that.
Totally. There's a few questions already about journal selection. The number one thing, well, I heard this explained really well once in another event. Like, it's like 3 legs to a stool when you do research and get it published. Most people put lots of time and energy and money into the research and into the writing. So that's critical. But most people actually don't put much time into journal selection, and you should, because as Avi's just said, like, it's really important both for your career, the impact factor of the journal, and the time it might take and the cost that it might incur for that publication to come out. So keep in mind that there's loads of journal selection tools out there, loads of them, but most of them are owned by publishers. So if you go and you search on the Hindawi or the Wiley or the Taylor and Francis or the Springer Nature journal selection tool, you're going to get pushed towards journals that those publishers own. Edance, another of our companies that we work with a lot, has an impartial journal selector tool that's worth checking out. There's also the directory of open access journals and a great website called thinkchecksubmit.org, which I've pasted in the chat for you. On the Edance selector tool and on the doaj.org tool, you can search for open access journals by cost. So you can put in your keywords, you can search for journals, you can sort them by cost. So you can use those tools to find places where you can get your work published with a decent impact factor and keep the cost down if you want to go for open access.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Gareth. And we're going to be posting, we've also got a similar tool on our website that we're going to be posting here in a minute. We sent it out in a recent newsletter, and I think those are really helpful. The one thing I would say is be critical. It's like doing a Google search, right? So you're going to search for something on Google. Half the results you're going to get are going to be total rubbish and not helpful to you. So don't just sort of assume that whatever you're going to get out of the search engine is going to be relevant and important. I actually think that many of them end up, you say, this is not relevant, right? Because it is a search engine in the end of the day, and it has its limits. So always be critical, always go back and read those, those previous abstracts from the journal to make sure that it's relevant. Now, we got an interesting question coming in here. Which kind of moves us maybe in the direction of what happens when we get the actual review back. How do we handle that, right? So we've got a question here, I believe from Joy. Thanks so much. So if the editor says that they're going to consider accepting the paper, assuming that we incorporate the reviewer's comments, first of all, is there a chance that it's going to be rejected anyway, right? And second of all, do we, like, how much do we actually have to listen to the reviewers? How much do we have to respond to them? So I'll just jump in here, and then Gareth, I'm curious to hear what you think. First of all, the first thing I would say is you do not have to accept every comment that is suggested. You do not, okay? Some of the comments are going to be total, crap. Excuse my language. Like, they're just not going to be relevant. And you as the researcher know, they did not understand something. Now, you do have to ask yourself, well, maybe there's something I didn't explain clearly enough, so I need to go back and explain it. You do need to write a letter where you answer those questions or those points in an organized and intelligent way so that the reviewers understand where you're coming from and why you made the decisions that you did. But that does not mean that you absolutely have to, you do have to respond politely and explain. You do not have to accept each and every comment. That's number one. In terms of incorporating the reviewer comments, yes, there is still a chance that your article will get rejected. There are times where the initial reviews will sound positive and they'll say, oh, just do XYZ. And then you do XYZ and then you send it back and you think, okay, I'm ready to go. And they say, thank you, but we're no longer interested, or we've decided to go with other articles. Other articles might have come in the meantime that they prefer. They may think that you haven't addressed their comments correct, to enough of an extent, or they may just, have changed their mind, right? The reviewers are human beings, and they act that way. So there's no guarantee, but like we said, you're on the right path. You're on the right track if you've gotten revisions, and it makes sense, unless you've had a change of heart, to implement those revisions. However, you're not bound. This is not a marriage. If you decide based on the comments, you're like, they don't get it. They don't get what I'm trying to do. Or the amount of work that's going to be needed in order to address their comments means restarting the study from scratch. So forget it. Move on. There are tens of thousands of journals. I don't know. I feel like soon it's going to be hundreds of thousands, Garrett, that are out there in the world. You're not bound. You're not limited. You're the owner of your research until you sign off, right? Your copyright, but you're the owner of your research. You get to decide what happens with it. No one else.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. I mean, I agree completely. Reviewers can say what they want about your paper. Reviewers can write anything that they like about your paper, and they don't have to have any evidence for it. They can just say, I think this is not correct, or I think that this method is not appropriate. But when you respond, when you write your response and go back to the journal, as Avi said, you don't have to make all of the changes that the reviewers are asking for. But I would say if you're not going to make a change that the reviewers have asked for, you would need to explain why not to the editor. And that should be done, if possible, with evidence. So peer reviewers don't have to have any evidence. They can just say, I think it's the wrong method that this author's using. But when you respond to that, you've got to convince the editor that your opinion is the correct one. So you need to balance your responses with some evidence. And that's what makes it difficult for authors often responding to peer review comments. But keep in mind as well that it's not like the editor is sitting down and writing those emails that you get back from the journal. They're all automatically generated by a submission system. So if you do get wording in the email that comes back from the journal that says, we would be prepared to accept this paper if you can make the changes that have been requested, that's probably a minor revision. And probably if you do enough to convince the editor that you've taken the comments seriously, the paper's probably going to get accepted. Be warier of emails that say major revisions, moderate revisions, your paper may need to go back again for peer review, because that's a major revision. The editors click that box in the online submission system. Then you have to do more work and be more comprehensive when you make your revisions. But there's different strategies you can adopt for all of these different responses. Yeah, great question though.
I wanna tell you a story. When we were first starting out, one of the first years of the company, we had one of our first books that we ever received. We were really excited about it, and it was a big opportunity for us. And we submitted it to the publisher, and a few days later, we got a response back. Please make sure that your book undergoes language editing before being, published. And my face fell. I mean, we had just spent 4 months editing and polishing and proofreading, and I started doubting. Well, are we not doing a good job? What did we do wrong? Are we going to need to pay a second editor to edit the entire book again? I thought we did a brilliant job, and I really was heartbroken. And I decided, you know what? Instead of just kind of like taking it at its word, let me write back to the publisher and let me ask them, can you give some examples of editing that needed to be done? And their response knocked me off my feet. They wrote, "Oh, we took a look now. It's great. It's brilliant. This is just template text, meaning this is text that we send to everybody. Please edit and revise your paper, regardless of whether we looked at it and decided if it needs it or not." And that shocked me to the core. Like I said, we almost went ahead and, redid our entire project from scratch because of some template text that was sent in. So that's really important point, is to like really make sure that you're, think about like what is coming from an individual reviewer and what's just like kind of general notes from a publisher, about how they want things done, which if you've done, you don't need to do again. I also want to point out that I just shared what I think is the best journal finding tool. We partnered with Kronos Hub. I don't know if you're familiar with this tool, Gareth, but I think it's amazing. They have a really advanced journal finder, and we partnered with them in order to put it up on our website. So you're welcome to check that out there. And it's a really powerful tool to kind of find what the best publishing, options may be for you. Again, don't just take everything there as, God's directive from heaven. You really have to think critically about whether it's relevant for you or not. All right, should we keep on? We've got a lot of great questions here, so let's I see there's some questions about APCs, so I do want to kind of address that quickly. Although, Gareth, I think it might be a good idea for us to kind of actually dedicate an entire session, maybe in the upcoming months, to APCs, if that's a topic that is relevant. But maybe just, on one leg, you can kind of, give us a little bit of an insight about that.
On APCs, yeah, like these are like the dreaded 3-letter acronym that all authors hate. Like APCs, article processing charges. This is a charge that an open access journal almost always makes to authors in order that the publisher still makes some money from the publishing process. As you know, traditional journals, you submit your paper, you wouldn't have to pay to get it published once it had been peer reviewed, but the publishers sell that content back to institutions, to medical schools, to countries, even behind a firewall. So that's the traditional model. Open access publishing, that's where anyone can get access to your content. Most authors do want to publish their papers in open access journals, but there's a cost because, of course, publishers have to make their crust. So those APCs are the charges that get passed back to funding agencies or to authors. And the average charge, it's about $1,500, I know, to publish a paper open access. But yeah, lots of these tools that we've been talking about, as I mentioned already, will give you the option to search and look for a journal that doesn't have a high APC. The other thing I would say is that if you're a student or an early career researcher and you can't afford these APCs and you want to publish your paper in Scientific Reports or PLOS or Frontiers, write to the editor and say that, because very often they do have waivers available and they're able to be flexible on these charges. And a lot of people don't know that. If you write to the editors at Scientific Reports, Frontiers, PLOS, and say, I'm a PhD student, I can't afford your APC charge, they'll say, no worries, publish it anyway. We used to do that all the time. And I used to work as an academic in the UK. We'd write and we'd say, we don't have the money. And they'd say, not a problem, fine. Like, just make a small contribution, the paper will get published anyway. So
yeah. And I think that's especially true for scholars who don't come from major, who don't have major funding behind them. And I think that's really important to not be embarrassed to say that. That's nothing to do with you, and to feel fully confident to be able to, go ahead and really ask for that discount or ask for it to be waived entirely. Now, I want to get back to the meat and potatoes, the heart of review itself. And I think that one of the elephants in the room that I really wanted to chat about today is, why are reviewers so damn mean? I wonder if, you can feel free to raise your hand, or, or even just know yourself, if you've had a review which you felt like this is more destructive than constructive. It's more frustrating than helpful. And so what do you, I don't think the reviewers are just mean people. What do you, attribute that to, Gareth? And what do you think, like, how should we respond when we get a peer review, which really is quite harsh?
I think, unfortunately, it's just human nature. And sadly, it tends to be the case that when you get a document to look at and a peer review to perform, people's immediate reaction is, where are the problems? Where are the issues? Rather than, how can I help these authors to improve. So we also spend quite a lot of time running training courses in this kind of thing, being positive in peer review. So why are people nasty? That's just human nature. Often people are a little bit jealous, I think, especially in those higher impact factor journals. How come this wasn't me submitting this paper to this journal? Let me try to find ways to torpedo this article, to find the problems with this article. But think about peer review as a positive process. I really would encourage you, if you get the chance to do peer review for a journal, take it as a positive experience. This is a hugely important transferable skill that you learn, or hopefully you get some experience in as an academic, that you can take off into other lines of work in the future. Imagine if your boss in a company gives you a document to comment on, and you are really negative and you try to find all the problems and poke all the holes that you can in that document. That isn't going to be the best approach for you in terms of your career development, of course. So that's what I encourage people to do with peer review. Of course, you do get very negative comments back about your work all the time, but try not to take it to heart and write to the editor. Write to the editor. If you feel that comments that you get are unnecessarily negative or personal, I've had comments like, this is the worst paper I've ever seen, this is awful research. The editor, the job of the editor is to adjudicate. And so you should write to them and say, I don't feel that this comment from reviewer 2 is appropriate. What do you think, editor? Do I have to respond to this comment? So, I mean, don't react. Don't react, because we get lots and lots of emails, lots of letters back from authors that are just as aggressive as the review comments. So sit back, take some time, don't react. Your key job is to keep the editor on your side in this process, I would say.
I think that's invaluable advice, because I think that whether or not your article is published is as much dependent on your response to the initial review as much as it is the initial science itself. The editor wants to see that you're willing to listen and to hear and to incorporate. And once you show that you can listen and you can be helpful and you can address the comments, then they're also willing to say, okay, you disagree on comment number 2 and 3, but you accept 4, 5, and 6. It shows that you are open-minded. It shows that you're willing to learn. And I'll tell you another thing. The scholars that I see that are successful long-term are the ones that know not to take the critique personally. I've met way too many scholars who have said to me, I got a review, and now my article has been sitting on my laptop for a year because I'm too scared to send it again. Rejection, and I know that's hard. It's a muscle. We're building a muscle that we don't have, right? It's like if we were to, I don't know, choose a spouse who would critique us 9 out of 10 times, we'd be like, this marriage is not going to work. But that's what academia is. So, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that you're not a good researcher. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that your research isn't good. It just means that that's our jobs, right? When we want to, right? If we were to, going back to the vaccine example, we would want to poke as many holes in the research as possible. We would want it to be checked and scrutinized and questioned from every angle, because we wouldn't want to, be putting something into our body which didn't go through the most rigorous peer review. But the fact that those things are questioned and debated and challenged, I think in the end of the day, if it's done in a constructive way, is actually a really good, important thing. So if you learn to love the hate, I know that sounds ridiculous, but to learn to love the comments, even if they're negative, and to grow and to learn and to improve and see them as a building process, I think you'll be in a much better position career-wise. In fact, I saw a study recently, Gareth, which blew me away. It said as follows, and I'll try to make this as clear as possible. Studies that were rejected from the first journal, okay, and then accepted into a second journal or a third journal, were more successful long-term in terms of reads and citations than articles that were accepted to the first journal that they got accepted right away. And what that taught me was that actually, what does that show? That the more peer review and the more critique and the more suggestions you receive, the better your article gets and the better it is long-term. So don't get down if you don't get accepted to the first journal, or if there are critical reviewers, because actually in the long run, it can mean that you're going to be more successful.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And you should be probably getting rejected from your first journal. You should be probably getting rejected from your first journal, because you should be submitting your papers to the best possible journals. So what that means is that you should go with your articles to journals with higher impact factors first. Make a list of journals that you'd like to see your papers published in, that other researchers, leading researchers in your field are using for their research. Go first to Nature, go first to Science, go first to the Lancet, the BMJ. You might get rejected, probably you will get rejected, but you might get peer review comments, which will improve the paper for the next submission. So part of the trick, actually, of being a successful publishing academic is shooting for the stars, going for those higher impact factor journals, dealing with rejection when it happens, appealing that process if you feel you've been badly treated, and moving on to the next journal without taking it to heart. I got a paper published in Nature Communications, and one of the papers that I published in Nature got rejected. Both those papers rejected the first time around, really negative comments, but we appealed. We asked the editor, we said, we don't agree with these comments. In the case of the Nature paper, the reviewer didn't understand the method that we'd used. That was clear from their comments. The paper got rejected, but we wrote to the editor and we said, can we resubmit? Can we ask for a second round of peer review? It's clear that reviewer 2 didn't understand the method for these reasons. The editor agreed, and the paper went out for review and it got accepted. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? If the paper's already been rejected, the worst that can happen if you appeal is that it's going to stay rejected. So it's always, always, always worth appealing decisions, talking to editors if you feel that there's a chance that you could get the paper accepted if you can address the comments. And indeed, more and more journals are doing what we call soft rejection with papers these days. That's where you get a letter from the editor automatically generated that says, your paper's been rejected, Gareth, but we would invite, or we would consider, a resubmission if you feel you can address the comments in this first version. And journals do that to keep their rejection rates high. Rejection rates, part of the impact factor calculation process. It's in the journal's interest to reject your paper, but they do it in a soft way. It's called a soft rejection. They'll invite you in the letter. They'll say something like, we would consider a resubmission if you feel you can address the comments. And then you put the paper in as a new submission. That keeps the submission rate up, and eventually you'll get accepted. So keep an eye on the wording of those emails that come back from journals as well.
Yeah, and I want to add one thing that I'm seeing more and more and more, and I think that this is going to become standard practice, and that is journals turning around and saying, you are rejected for this journal that we run, that you submitted to. However, I want to give you a list of 2 or 3 other journals that may be interested, because the publishers want you to stay. They don't want you to leave, but they may think that it's more appropriate for another journal. Now, be careful, okay? Sometimes the journals that they're going to be recommending are not as highly regarded as the original one. Don't assume just because you originally tried with Taylor and Francis or with a Wiley journal or with another journal that all of their journals are of the same value. That is not true. There are certain journals that are better. There are certain journals that are newer or not as good. So consider it, meaning if they're inviting you to resubmit to a different journal, definitely think about it. There's nothing wrong with that. However, don't automatically say, okay, great, like this is going to be fantastic. It may not be in your best interest. You always have to think about, what are they suggesting to me? And like Gareth said before, they're only going to suggest what's in their own best interest. They're not looking and telling you, well, actually go, if I'm in Taylor and Francis, I'm not going to go tell you to submit to a Wiley journal, because that's going to send you out to somewhere else. So they're only going to tell you what they want you to do. So think about it, consider it, but don't automatically say yes, because it may or may not be good for you.
Let us know your subject area too, if you're thinking about making submissions, because as Avi said, like, individual publishers will want to keep you in their system. So if you get rejected from Nature, they'll say, wouldn't you like to transfer this paper to Nature Communications or Scientific Reports within the Springer Nature publishing group, within the transfer system? But there are some subjects, and I pasted a link to the Neuroscience Peer Review Consortium, some subject areas where different journals from different publishers have been brought together within a subject area specific consortium. So this is a really cool idea. And in neuroscience, for example, you submit to one journal in that consortium, you get rejected, you can transfer the paper to any other journal, irrespective of the publisher that's sitting within that consortium. So it's worth checking your subject area to see if there's something similar. In physics, there's another one that I know of. So,
yeah, and it works a little bit differently, but I know that in law, so you submit to Scholastica, and then you get, the law reviews will go through, and different law reviews can pick up on your article, which is also, I think, a nice sort of way that it's not just one at a time. But I think the majority of the scholars that are joining us today probably, they won't have that. It's still working according to the old model. I want to just do a quick timeout for two purposes. Number one is I want to give everyone just 30 seconds to think about, if you do want to open your mic and ask a question. You've heard a lot of me and Gareth chatting, but I do like hearing other voices. If your concern has to do with the clarity of your English, we understand. This is our jobs, is to help scholars for whom English is not their mother tongue, not their native language, to help them through those issues. So we're patient. Don't worry if if it's difficult for you to express yourself. We want to hear you. We want to hear your questions, and we want to hear your voice. So please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we'll take your questions. Also, I think maybe we could just take 30 seconds now to share upcoming events. There's upcoming events both at Research Square that Garrett's in charge of, as well as Academic Language Experts, my company. And but I'll start by saying that hopefully next month, I believe it is on the last day of October, that's October 31st, at 10 o'clock UK time, we will have our next event with Gareth, or our next chat with Gareth and I together, chatting about these topics. You're welcome to join us. We don't yet have the landing page up just yet, but it will be up quite soon, hopefully. And we're going to be talking about how to construct your research question, how to find the gap in the research that really will become a compelling article. We're going to try throughout the series to start from the very beginning, from the time you have your research question till the time of choosing a journal, APCs, how to get your article published. We're going to go through and pick one topic every month and really do a deep dive on that topic. So we're going to start out with talking about developing your research question. That's going to start next month. Gareth, do you want to throw up on your screen maybe some of the upcoming AG
Sure.
or Research Square events?
Sure. We have a webinar next Thursday, the 22nd, which will be at 5 o'clock in the afternoon British summertime, 12 o'clock Eastern time in the US. And that's going to be a discussion about preprinting. Our company, Research Square, is the largest preprint server out there. So if you'd like to learn more about preprints, how to preprint, and how preprinting your research can help accelerate peer review and accelerate your career, then do join us next Thursday. I pasted the link. And Tanvir has his hand up, Avi. So maybe we should go to...
Yeah, I'll get to him in just a second. Just quickly, Alana, if you could throw up on the screen the upcoming Academic Language Experts events, in addition to what I do with Gareth. So we've got a monthly publication success interview series where we help scholars. So this month we're going to be interviewing Jane Jones, who's really great, talking about more the emotional side of writing, right? Writer's block, and getting over, negativity that we've talked about today, and really starting to love writing, because writing is a big part of what you're going to do as an academic scholar throughout your career. So encourage you to tune in for that. Alana, if you could scroll down as well. We've got another event coming up here. I think I need to click on the purple box. There you go. Thank you so much. We've got an event with Zoe Millen, who's the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, talking about how journals make decisions about what articles they're going to publish, right? How do they pick, okay, this is what interests us now? Because oftentimes we do our research based on what we think is interesting and important, but we don't actually think about what the journals are going to be interested in. And I think that's really important for career success. So Alana will throw the links to those up in the chat. Also, you can sign up for the AJE events, for the ALE events, and highly encourage you to continue your own education, because you can really save a lot of time that you may burn otherwise in trying, by learning in an organized way. There's no school for how to publish, right, Garrett? Maybe that's something that me and you should do together. But as of yet, there's no, degree program for how to publish your article. So attending these kind of events is really, quite useful. Brilliant. Okay, so let's get, yes, Tavin had a question. So yeah, please go right ahead. Tavin, you with us? All right. If you do want to, jump in there, please do. Anyone else want to jump in with a question?
So I have one question. Is it allowed? Yeah, I'm an interpreter working with a researcher. So
나는 한 방법으로 논문을 쓰는데
네.
A, B, C가 있다면 한 방법으로 A, B, C를 따로따로 만들었어요. 만든 것을 제출한다는 얘기죠. 그러면 그 방법에 대한 거는 리뷰어들이 관심을 가지는 건가?
So my question is, I am making A, B, and C separately based on one single methodologies, and this is how I have submitted. So is reviewer interested in this methodology, or is reviewer interested in A, B, and C?
Just to clarify, what does he mean by A, B, and C?
이 A, B, C라는 게 뭘 말씀하시는 건지.
논문이 A, B, C가 있는데 그 논문에 같은 방법이 적용돼서 여기 적용을 A 논문이 여기서 쓰여지고 B 논문이 여기 이렇게 C 논문이 이렇게 써진다. 그런 것도.
So what I meant is a paper. So paper A, paper B, and paper C, and all those papers are based on a single methodology. So are reviewers validating the methodology or paper A, B, and C separately?
Gareth, you want to take that? Yeah, understood. Thank you. You want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So you're going to be citing and basing your work on previous studies, papers A, B, and C, but the reviewer of your paper is not going to comment on previous papers. If you've cited them, and you may have cited them in a positive way, you may have cited them in a negative way, but their focus and what they're being asked to do by the journal is to comment on your paper, okay? And the only situation where a reviewer would make a comment about another piece of work would be if you're basing your method or your approach or your experiment, let's say, on something that's been published previously. If you say in your methods, the methods I use in this paper follow those that were, done by, Dr. Avi in his paper in 2012, then the reviewer might comment on that piece of work. Okay, so I hope that helps and answers the question.
Yeah, and I just want to add that in general, we discourage sending more than one paper at a time to a journal. In general, you want, for your own purposes, you're going to want to show that you have published in a range of different journals and not just one place, because it shows that your research is taken seriously by different scholars in different places, in different contexts. If you only have 5 articles all published in the same journal, others may, when you apply for a grant or you go for promotion, they may ask, well, why hasn't this individual been able to publish in different places? So I think that's really important to kind of keep in mind, as well as you do want to vary that as much as possible. I will go over what most of you already know, which is that you are not allowed to submit one article to multiple places. That is actually different than books. Books you can actually submit to multiple book proposals to different publishers at the same time, but with journals, you are not allowed to do that. All right, we've got a question. Sorry?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually in the middle of writing up a really massive randomized controlled trial, but not that I'm talking about. I've also got I'm trying to develop a new treatment for nerve entrapments, and I've got a case series, but I did it retrospectively because I couldn't get a grant, and it would have been involved. If I would have done it prospectively, I would have had to charge, wouldn't been able to charge money to the hospital, and it would have been too much of a mess. So I did this retrospective. I've got a retrospective case series to write up. But the thing is that all of my patients that we've followed up retrospectively have been followed up at completely different times. And I'm just wondering, is that going to look very credible at all if I publish such a thing? I mean, some have been followed up a month later, 2 months later, a year later, 2 years later. You know, whenever they came back, whenever I found them, whenever I got hold of them by telephone, whatever.
You have to make it appear to the journal that was your plan when you put the paper together. Okay, now retrospective trials like this are problematic for journals often because you haven't registered it. Or did you register the study before you started?
I didn't register it because it was retrospective, and I
right.
didn't have to do that.
Right, so the most important thing to do is to register the trial now, because journals will be looking for that when you make submissions, and lots of medical journals won't consider the study unless you have it registered. So do that before you make the submission, and let's work on the method section so that it looks like the way that you followed up with the patients was your plan all along. That's my advice in that situation.
I thought that for a retrospective trial you didn't have to register.
It's worth doing it anyway, just to make sure that you have that in the method section and ready for the journal.
Okay.
I would do it anyway if I were you.
What happens if I just retire from the hospital? How do I do that?
Well, you have a national agency, or you can register with the UN. The UN has a database that you can put your work into as well.
Good enough just to register in clinical trials?
Could do, yeah. I can send you some links and follow up if you.
Okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Asnat. Asgar, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name right. Go ahead.
Thank you for providing me the opportunity to ask question. I am Asgar, a PhD scholar. My question is that I'm mostly facing with problems of novelty, that when I submit paper to a journal, then my paper is rejected due to the cause is that your manuscript does not contain any type of novelty. So how novelty can be put in articles and manuscripts? This is my question.
Yeah, really good question. Really good question. Okay, so I think in order to start, obviously each field is its own, its own answer. But in order to start addressing this question, really you need to figure out where you are building on previous research. Again, I think that novelty is a tricky word because on the one hand, you need to do something new. On the other hand, it needs to be based and rooted in previous research and in that's already been done. So what you want to say is scholar A has done X, scholar B has done Y, but they have not figured out Z. They haven't figured out something that is important. And here is what I'm doing that no one else has done. Now, it could be that you're already doing that what you're doing, no one else has done. It could be that your issue is that it's just not clear enough to them how what you're doing is different from what they've done. So if you know who you are in conversation with, if you know the other scholars in your field, make it seem as if you're continuing their discussion, their research, but you're building on it, but you're expanding on it, you're explaining it better, you're talking about why it's important what you're doing and why you're the person that can really do it. So, and obviously it starts with doing a very thorough literature review, and that's really difficult to do because there have been cases, right, where I've seen scholars who didn't even know that someone else on the other side of the world was working on something very similar and maybe managed to publish it a little bit sooner. And so it's important to do a very thorough, just always, I recommend every week, read 1 or 2 journals in your field so that you're getting into that mindset of what is being talked about and make sure that what you're doing is really different than those around you. Hopefully, if you take those 2 steps, reading the journals and becoming familiar with the literature, and then putting yourself in that context of the literature, then you can really get yourself forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Tanvir is back with us. I'm sorry that I mispronounced your name before. He's maybe still joining us. So if Tanvir comes back, we'd love to take his question. Does anyone else have any questions in the interim? All right, we've got a hand raised here. Did anyone see who that? Whoever, I didn't see who raised their hand, but whoever did raise their hand is welcome to jump in. You don't need to wait for a personal invitation. All right. In order to, we've gone an hour, so I want to bring things to their conclusion, but I do want to quickly address what I think is important, and that is, Gareth, maybe you can share with us, first of all, how does someone become a reviewer if they want to become one? And second of all, is it a paid position to be a reviewer or not?
Yeah, two great questions. Well, no, like, unfortunately, and this is a very often asked question, like, journals don't pay for peer review. It's very controversial because, of course, you think, well, the publishers are making money, they're selling on this research to universities and institutions, like, how come I'm not getting paid for my work? And it's something that is thought about and discussed a lot. There are several sites out there that link with journals that do provide other credits and other, like, things that you can kind of cash in your time as a reviewer. Publons is the most well-known of these kinds of sites. So do make sure you have an ORCID ID, a Publons account, so that when you do review for a journal, you get some credit for that. You can add it to your CV. You can talk about it when you have to next, like, apply for a job or apply for a grant. But at the moment, unfortunately, like, people aren't paid for their work as peer reviewers. How can you get to do it? Well, my advice in this situation is just to write to editors. Just talk to editors at journals in your subject area and tell them about what you're doing. Tell them that you're working on your PhD, or you're a postdoc, or you'd like to get experience working as a reviewer for their journal, because they'll be very happy to hear from you. I can guarantee it, because finding reviewers is one of the biggest issues that journal editors face. And often young researchers, up-and-coming researchers, provide much better feedback on papers in peer review than some of the more established colleagues. So those are some pieces of advice. Hope that helps.
Yeah, ironically enough, you know, we call it blind peer review, but I think anyone who's done enough peer reviews realizes that oftentimes you can figure out who's writing the article if you're familiar enough with the field. And sometimes the reviewers aren't necessarily as experienced as the authors themselves. So, you know, it's important to find this balance between respecting what's written and trying to consider it, and not just thinking whatever I did is the best way, no matter what. But also on the flip side, realizing that you don't need to agree and accept everything that's done. So I want to give one last opportunity for one final question. If there's anyone in the crowd who still, you know, has something that's burning, but I know that everyone needs to get back to the rest of their day. So yeah, so is there anyone who has one last thing that they want to kind of get in here before we say goodbye? All right, if not, so this was really great. This was I'll tell you the behind the scenes. Gareth and I sort of came up with this crazy idea, like, instead of just talking at you the whole time, maybe we can, like, you know, hear what the struggles are. And I think that really happened today, and I learned a lot. So I want to thank first of all, Gareth, for you know, joining me and really providing tremendous insight into the industry. I want to thank everyone who took from their days to join us, and I want to encourage you to you know, to continue to you know, to join our monthly events. You'll be seeing them, you know, you'll be getting emails about them, so look out for those, and continue to ask us your questions. If you do have a question afterwards, you've got my email in the, you know, in the picture here. I'll throw it into the chat as well. I'm sure Gareth is happy to field questions. Gareth, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I put my email in the chat, Gareth.Dyke, Gareth.Dyke@researchsquare.com. When's our next event, Avi? It's coming up next month.
Yes, October 31st, 12 o'clock UK time. Yeah, 12 o'clock. No, excuse me, 10 o'clock UK time. My apologies, 10 o'clock AM UK time. And really, you know, more than welcome. We encourage you to join us for that. I also have I think both of us, Garrett, both have presence on LinkedIn. So if anyone is on LinkedIn or on Twitter and wants to follow us and kind of follow our updates, I don't know, Garrett, I don't know how you do it. You have like more posts on LinkedIn than I think anyone I've ever met, and it's super active and super helpful. So I'm going to put your LinkedIn link there as well.
That's very nice of you. Thank you.
Anyone is on there, like, both of us, I post once a week or once every other week, try to make it helpful content, but Garrett is like a machine there. So, follow us both on LinkedIn, and yeah, thanks. So thanks for coming out and thanks for joining us. And we hope that it's been really helpful. So don't be strangers and be in touch. All right. Thanks everybody. Cheers. Take care now. Bye-bye.